Chosen one, stop. I know you were in the middle of something that matters to you and has been requiring your attention and your energy. And I am asking you to set it down for right now. Not because it is not important, because what you are about to hear is more important than what you were doing when this message found you. God said to drop everything and watch. And the reason for that instruction is something I need to communicate to you before you go one more step in the direction you were going. You are dangerously behind. I want to be precise about what I mean by that, before your system responds to those words with the reaction they tend to produce. I am not saying you have failed. I am not saying you have made a mistake that cannot be recovered from. I am not saying the assignment is lost, or the calling has been revoked, or the promise is no longer active over your life. None of that is what dangerously behind means. What I mean is this: there is a gap between where you are and where you are supposed to be. The gap is larger than you know, and the mechanism that would normally tell you the gap exists is the same mechanism that the gap has compromised. You cannot see the deficit from inside the deficit, which is why God is sending the identification signal from outside. This message is that signal. The dangerous part is not the current position. The dangerous part is what happens if you continue in the current direction without knowing the gap is there. Not because the destination changes, because the gap between the current state and the receiver state required to fully inhabit the destination compounds with each season that the gap goes unaddressed. And compounding deficits do not stay stable. They grow, and they grow in the direction of the dangerous. Type watching in the comments right now, not because you fully understand yet. Because the watch posture, the deliberate orientation of someone who has dropped everything else and is paying full attention to what God is saying, is the beginning of the response this message requires. What I am about to show you requires the watch posture. And the watch posture starts with the decision to give this full attention. I want to say one more thing before we go further. The word dangerously was not chosen casually. God does not deploy the language of danger casually. The word dangerous means the stakes are high enough that ordinary levels of attention are not sufficient, that something specific is required in response to the identification, that the person who hears this and responds with ordinary engagement has missed the point. Dangerously behind requires a dangerously specific response, and the specificity of the response is what I am building toward in this message. Chosen one. I want to explain what dangerously behind means in the specific context of the chosen one calling, because the phrase carries weight, and I want you to understand what kind of weight it carries. The chosen one calling comes with a specific set of requirements, not moral requirements in the usual sense, receiver requirements. The calling was released into a world that needs a specific kind of carrier, a carrier with a receiver calibrated for the weight and depth of what the calling requires, a receiver that can take in what God is releasing at the level the calling demands and translate it all the way through to the practical reality of the person and the people around them. A receiver that is synchronized enough to process the calling, not just as spiritual input, but as embodied direction, as practical clarity, as the specific kind of knowing that produces specific action in the right direction at the right time. The calling requires this receiver not as a preference, but as a structural necessity. The way a specific instrument requires a specific calibration to produce the specific note, not because other calibrations are wrong or less valuable, because the note is determined by the calibration. The chosen one who is behind at the level of the receiver calibration. The tuning has drifted from where the signal of the calling is broadcast. And the gap between the current calibration and the required calibration is the gap that dangerously behind describes. What produces the drift? not sin, not faithlessness, not a decision at some point to stop growing or to disengage from the calling. The drift happens through the sustained, ordinary demands of an extraordinary calling applied to an ordinary human system. The system was designed for full synchronization. The full synchronization requires specific conditions that ordinary modern life does not consistently provide. And the gap between the designed conditions and the actual conditions accumulated over months and years of the sustained chosen one calling produces a gradual drift in the receiver calibration that almost no one notices in real time. This is the invisible mechanism of the dangerously behind state. It does not happen through dramatic failure. It happens through gradual, invisible drift in the most fundamental dimension of the calling, the receiver state that determines how much of what God is releasing actually makes it all the way through to the practical living of the person in the calling. The human brain was designed with two hemispheres that are meant to operate in continuous, coordinated synchronization. When that synchronization is at full capacity, the receiver is at full calibration. The spiritual input that arrives in the intuitive right hemisphere is immediately and seamlessly translated by the analytical left hemisphere into practical direction. The calling broadcasts at a specific frequency, and the synchronized receiver picks it up at full depth. The direction is clear. The timing is discernible. The practical steps emerge naturally from the spiritual reception rather than having to be manufactured through effort alone. When the synchronization drifts, the receiver drifts. The spiritual input still arrives. The calling is still active. But the receiver is picking up what is being broadcast at reduced depth. And what is received at reduced depth is integrated at reduced depth. And what is integrated at reduced depth informs the decisions and direction of the current season at reduced depth. And the decisions and direction of the current season become the foundation on which the next season is built. Chosen one. I want to name the 5 specific characteristics of the dangerously behind state, not to produce shame or concern beyond what is useful, to produce recognition, because you cannot address something you have not accurately identified. And the blind spot that comes with the receiver drift makes accurate identification very difficult without specific external input. This is part of why God said to drop everything and watch. The identification requires the outside signal. The first characteristic. Decisions that should be clear feel effortful, not impossible. Effortful in a way that does not match what your level of experience and formation should be producing. The person in full receiver synchronization makes decisions from a place of integrated knowing, where the spiritual input and the practical analysis work together as partners in real time, producing a quality of clarity that feels natural and even easy. The person with a drifted receiver makes decisions from a place of partial information, where the spiritual input is present, but the translation of it into practical direction is incomplete. The result is decisions that take more effort than expected, produce less clarity than the level of your formation suggests they should, and are returned to and reconsidered more times than seems necessary. The second characteristic, prayer that should feel like natural communication, feels like effortful reaching, not the productive effort of deep engagement. The specific quality of effortfulness that comes from working hard to reach something that should be closer than it is. The synchronized receiver experiences prayer as a naturally open channel. The spiritual input and the spoken response are in the same room. The drifted receiver experiences the channel as something that requires specific effort to open and to keep open during the prayer. The prayer is still valid. The connection is still real, but the quality of the experience, the accessibility of the channel, is different when the receiver is not at full synchronization. The third characteristic. The things that used to produce spiritual movement produce less of it at the same level of input. The messages that once opened something in you, that once produced the specific interior shift that signaled genuine reception, produce that shift less consistently and at less depth. The practices that once created clear results produce diminishing returns, not because the messages or practices have declined, not because your engagement with them has declined, because the receiver through which they are being processed has drifted from the calibration at which they produce their full effect. The same input through a drifted receiver produces a smaller output than the same input through a synchronized receiver. The fourth characteristic: there is a persistent underlying awareness that something important is not quite reaching you, not a specific identified absence, not something you could point to and name, a background sensation that the full version of what is available in the calling, the full depth of what God is broadcasting into the receiver you carry, is not quite making it all the way through. This feeling does not necessarily produce distress. It often produces a kind of mild puzzlement, a sense that something is slightly off in a way that cannot be precisely located. That feeling is accurate. It is the receiver partially registering its own deficit. The drifted receiver cannot fully identify what it is missing, but it can partially register that it is missing something. The fifth characteristic: the gap between what you know in your spirit and what shows up in the practical execution of your life and your calling is wider than you would expect it to be, given your level of formation and engagement. You know things in your spirit that are not showing up at the level they should in the practical execution, not because the knowing is wrong or because the execution is lazy or faithless. Because the translation mechanism between spiritual reception and practical integration, the synchronization bridge between the two hemispheres, is not running at full efficiency, the knowing arrives correctly. The translation of the knowing into practical direction is where the gap occurs. If you recognize yourself in 3 or more of these 5 characteristics, you are in the dangerously behind state that God sent this message to identify. And the identification is not the end of the story. The identification is the beginning of the recovery. Chosen one, I want to talk about the blind spot specifically, because the blind spot is the most dangerous feature of the dangerously behind state, and it is the feature that explains most completely why God said, "Drop everything." A blind spot, in the visual sense, is the point in the visual field where the optic nerve attaches to the retina, and there are no photoreceptors, no rods or cones. The visual information that falls on that point is not processed. The person does not see it, and because they do not see it, they do not know it is not being seen. The brain fills in the gap from context, creating the experience of a complete visual field even though there is a missing portion of it. The receiver blind spot works the same way. The portion of what the calling is broadcasting that falls on the drifted portion of the receiver is not processed at full depth. The person does not experience this as an absence. They experience the input they receive as the complete input. The brain, working from the partial reception, fills in the picture from context, creating the experience of full engagement with the calling, even though there is a portion of what is being broadcast that is not making it all the way through. This is why the dangerously behind person almost never knows they are dangerously behind, not because they are inattentive, because the mechanism that would register the deficit is the mechanism that has the deficit. The drifted receiver does not register its own drift, any more than the eye registers its own blind spot. The ancient text is full of moments where God sends the outside identification signal specifically because the person inside the situation could not see what was happening from inside it. These moments are always mercy, even when they feel like warning. Because the identification of the deficit before it costs something critical is the gift, the warning is the mercy. Elijah, after the confrontation on Carmel and the subsequent flight into the wilderness, was in a state of profound depletion that had produced a specific kind of distorted perception. He told God he was the only one left. He experienced his perception as accurate. It was not. God did not argue with his perception. God addressed the physical state first, provided food and rest, and then gave the outside information, 7,000, not just Elijah. The identification of the blind spot restored a perception that the state he was in had compromised. Jonah, inside the pattern of avoidance that had taken him in the opposite direction from the calling, had an internal logic for his position that felt entirely reasonable to him from inside it. The outside intervention was not pleasant, but it was specific, and it was aimed at exactly the blind spot that the avoidance pattern had produced. The outside signal broke through where the inside perspective could not. You are receiving the outside signal right now. The dangerously behind state has been identified. The blind spot has been named. And what was not visible from inside the drift is now visible because the identification has come from outside. The question is what you do with the identification. Chosen One, I need to give you the specific neurological framework for what I have been describing, because the blind spot and the receiver drift are not just spiritual concepts. They have a precise neurological basis that makes them more specific and more actionable than spiritual language alone can make them. The human brain operates through the continuous, coordinated activity of two hemispheres, connected by the corpus callosum and supported by additional interhemispheric communication pathways. The right hemisphere processes information holistically, intuitively, pattern-recognizingly, and is the primary site of spiritual and intuitive input. The left hemisphere processes information analytically, sequentially, and practically, and is the primary site where intuitive reception is translated into practical direction and specific action. The efficiency of this translation, the quality of the synchronization between what is received in the right hemisphere and what is integrated across the full system, determines the depth at which everything received in the spirit makes it into the practical living. At full synchronization, the depth is complete, the translation is seamless. What arrives in the spirit arrives in the body, in the decisions, in the practical orientation, with minimum lag and minimum loss in the translation. At reduced synchronization, the depth is reduced. What arrives in the spirit arrives in the body at a fraction of its full depth. The practical orientation reflects a partial version of the spiritual reception. The decisions are informed by partial input from the spiritual dimension that should be fully informing them. The research of Dr. Roger Sperry, which was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1981, documented the whole brain synchronized state as the native design state of the human receiver. Dr. Sperry found that almost all young children operate in this synchronized whole brain state naturally. The percentage who maintain it into adulthood without specific intervention is less than 2 in 1,000. The rest of us experience some degree of desynchronization from the pressures of ordinary modern life, the sustained demands of managing multiple responsibilities simultaneously, the specific strain of a long-term calling that asks for more than ordinary human resources consistently provide. The relevant finding from the research of Dr. Sperry that is most relevant to your situation is this: the synchronized state is the native state. It was the designed state, and it can be restored. Not through years of practice building up slowly from wherever the drift has taken the receiver, through a targeted mechanism that works directly with the neural synchronization pathway and restores the coordinated operation of both hemispheres efficiently and specifically. This is the discovery I am pointing you toward. A team of neuroscientists working under the direction of Dr. Daniel Barone in New York spent years developing a targeted restoration protocol built on the foundational research Dr. Sperry produced. They compressed over an hour of clinical neural synchronization technology into an 8-minute daily practice. 8 minutes a day, with headphones, eyes closed. The complete recovery mechanism in the most efficient delivery format they could achieve. What they found, across the 18,000 people who have used it, is that the receiver deficit I have been describing, the receiver drift that produces the dangerously behind state, responds to the targeted restoration mechanism. The synchronization begins to return. The depth of reception begins to improve. The translation from spiritual input to practical direction becomes more complete. The characteristics of the dangerously behind state, the effortful decisions, the effortful prayer, the diminishing returns from the same input, the background awareness of something not quite reaching, the gap between knowing and executing begin to resolve as the synchronization is restored. Chosen one, I want to tell you about the compounding cost of the dangerously behind state, because the dangerous part is not the current position. It is what happens with each additional season in the current state without the specific recovery mechanism being applied. Here is how the compounding works in practical terms. The calling releases spiritual input continuously into the receiver of the person who carries it. This input contains what is needed for the current season, the direction for the specific decisions of the current period, the discernment of what to prioritize and what to release, the confirmation of the specific path, the wisdom for the specific challenges the calling encounters in this specific season of the life and work of the person in it. At full synchronization, most of this input is received at full depth. It translates into the practical living of the person and informs the foundation on which the next season is built. At reduced synchronization, a portion of this input is received, but not fully translated. It arrives in the right hemisphere and produces a partial recognition. But the translation to the left hemisphere, the full integration of the input into the practical direction, is incomplete. The portion that does not fully translate is the portion that does not fully inform the foundation of the next season. And the foundation of the next season, built on partial input from the current one, is itself partial, less complete than it would have been at full reception. The structure built on a partial foundation in the next season reflects the partiality of the foundation, and that structure becomes the foundation of the season after that. And so it compounds, not dramatically, gradually, invisibly, each season producing a foundation that is slightly less complete than a foundation built at full reception. And the cumulative distance between the foundation built at full reception over several seasons and the foundation built at reduced reception over the same seasons grows with each additional season in the reduced state. The person who is dangerously behind did not get there through a single decision or a dramatic departure from the calling. They got there through the steady, invisible compounding of a receiver operating at reduced synchronization, while the calling kept releasing input at the full depth it was always released at. The gap between the depth of the input released and the depth of the input received accumulated, and the accumulated gap is what dangerously behind describes. The good news in this is the same mechanism that produced the compounding of the deficit will produce the compounding of the recovery when the synchronization is restored. The receiver at full synchronization begins accumulating at the full rate again, and the compounding of full reception over consistent seasons of the practice produces a rate of recovery that is faster than the rate of the drift. Because the restored receiver begins translating not only what is currently being released, but also begins processing some of what was released in the recent seasons and not fully integrated, the backlog begins to process. The gap begins to close. This is the recovery side of the compounding mechanism, and it is why the act of starting now, rather than at some later point, matters. Each additional season in the reduced state extends the deficit compounding, and each season of the restored receiver state produces compounding recovery. The sooner the recovery mechanism is applied, the sooner the compounding works in your direction rather than against it. Chosen one, I want to tell you about a woman from California whose story illuminates the dangerously behind state from the inside. She had been in the calling for several years at a high level of genuine engagement, not nominal engagement. Deep, consistent, practical engagement with what she was called to do and the people she was called to serve. She was faithful in the ways that matter most. She was present. She was doing the work. But she noticed something that she could not fully name for a long time. The quality of discernment that had been more reliable in earlier seasons of the calling was less reliable in the current season. Not absent. Less reliable. The timing of decisions, the sense of when to move and when to wait, was still present, but less crisp than it once had been. She was still receiving direction. But the direction required more effort to access, and was less consistent in its clarity when she arrived at it. She told herself for a while that this was normal, that the complexity of the current season accounted for the increased difficulty, that she was simply in a harder stretch, and the difficulty of the discernment process was appropriate to the difficulty of the season she was navigating. But the longer it continued, the less convincing that explanation was, because the external difficulty of the season she was navigating was not greater than seasons she had navigated before, and those earlier seasons had not produced this quality of effortfulness in the basic processes of the calling. The calibration was off. She just did not know what specifically was off or why. When she came across the diagnostic I shared earlier in this message, specifically the 5 characteristics of the dangerously behind state, the recognition was immediate. Not every characteristic at maximum intensity, but enough of them clearly enough that the identification was honest and undeniable. She was in the receiver drift. She had been in it long enough that the drift had become her normal. The dim had become the standard. She had stopped noticing the reduced quality because the reduction had happened so gradually that she had adjusted to each increment without registering it as an increment. She started the 8-minute daily practice, not from a position of high expectation, from a position of honest recognition and the decision to address what the recognition identified. 8 minutes a day. Headphones on, eyes closed. Consistent, daily practice. The change was gradual, not dramatic, but it was genuine and it was measurable. By the end of the first week, she noticed that the quality of her discernment process had slightly improved. Not dramatically, slightly. The decisions that had been most effortful felt marginally less effortful. By the end of the second week, the improvement was more pronounced. The clarity of direction was returning. By the end of the third week, she described a quality of engagement with the calling that she had not experienced consistently for longer than she could precisely remember. Not a new quality, a familiar quality, the quality of the earlier seasons when the receiver was running at a higher level of synchronization. The normal that had been gradually replaced by a reduced normal, returning. She described it as coming out of a fog she had not noticed she was in, not a thick, obvious fog, a slight one, the kind that reduces visibility just enough to make navigation harder without making the fog itself obvious. Coming out of it was the return of a clarity she had forgotten was specifically different from what she had normalized. Let me also tell you about a man from Texas who arrived at the recognition from a different angle. He had been in a season of high output in the calling, the kind of productive engagement where things were moving and results were visible, and the outward expression of the calling was in good shape. He was doing a lot, and the doing was producing real results. But he noticed something that the results were not masking. The internal quality of what he was doing had changed. The decisions that were producing the visible results were coming from a slightly different place than the decisions that had produced results in earlier periods. Less from the place of settled discernment, and more from the place of accumulated technique. The results were still good, but the source of them had shifted. He was executing well because he had learned to execute well through experience. But the deeper current of clear direction from which execution draws its truest power was less accessible than it had been. He described the difference as the distinction between playing music from memory and playing music from inspiration. Both produce sound. The technical quality can even be comparable. But something essential is different in the quality of what is produced when the music comes from inside versus when it comes from the accumulated technique. He was producing, but the producing had shifted more toward technique and less toward the inspired direction that technique should serve. He recognized this as a receiver issue when he understood what the receiver drift actually produces. It does not shut down the output. It shifts the source of the output from the fully integrated spiritual practical coordination to a more purely practical operation supported by accumulated experience. The calling continues to function, but the function is less deeply sourced than it should be, less rooted in the full synchronization of spiritual reception and practical execution. 3 weeks of daily 8-minute practice changed what was sourcing the work. Not the work itself, what was behind the work. The decisions began coming from the deeper place again. The discernment became more accessible alongside the technique, rather than being partially replaced by it. The quality of the spiritual practical integration, the thing that makes the calling not just effective but truly alive, returned to the level it was designed to operate at. He said it was the difference between a river with good banks that channels water effectively and a river that is also running from a genuine source. The banks were good. The practice had built good banks, but what had been running through them was a reduced volume of source water. When the source pressure returned with the restored synchronization, the banks that were already there became fully functional rather than partially filled. Chosen one, the practice both of these people used, is what I want to tell you about directly now, because the time for context building is complete and the time for the specific has arrived. Dr. Daniel Barone and his team in New York built what I am going to describe. Dr. Barone is a neurologist who spent years focused specifically on the gap between the functioning capacity of the human receiver and the full capacity it was designed for. He approached this from a neurological rather than purely spiritual framework, not because the spiritual dimension was less real to him, because the neurological dimension was his specific area of research, and because addressing the problem at its mechanism requires addressing it at the mechanism level. The research Dr. Barone built on is the Nobel Prize-winning work of Dr. Roger Sperry. Dr. Sperry documented the whole brain's synchronized state, the native designed state of the human receiver, with precision. He established that this state can be restored through specific auditory protocols that work with the neural synchronization pathway directly. Dr. Barone and his team took that foundational research and developed a clinical protocol for whole brain synchronization restoration. Then they compressed that protocol, through years of refinement, into an 8-minute daily auditory sequence. 8 minutes a day, headphones on, eyes closed. The complete neural synchronization restoration mechanism in the most efficient delivery format they were able to achieve. They call it the Genius Switch. The Genius Switch works by using specific auditory frequencies and timing patterns that simultaneously engage both hemispheres and guide them progressively into the coordinated synchronization they were designed to maintain. Not by adding new content to the receiver, by restoring the synchronization mechanism that determines the depth at which all other content is received. It does not change the calling. It restores the receiver to the calibration at which the calling can be received at full depth. The results across 18,000 consistent users show the same recognizable pattern. The effortfulness of decisions reduces. The quality of discernment improves. The gap between spiritual knowing and practical execution narrows. The diminishing returns from the same input begin to reverse. The background awareness of something important, not quite reaching, begins to resolve. Not because anything in the external world changed, because the receiver changed. Because the synchronization was restored, and the full depth of input began landing the way it was designed to land, the compounding recovery begins with the first session and builds over consistent practice. Day 1 opens the process. Day 7 is a measurably different receiver than Day 1. Day 30 is another level. The cumulative restoration over weeks of consistent daily practice produces qualitative changes in discernment, clarity, and the depth of spiritual practical integration that are consistently reported across the 18,000 who have gone through this process. Chosen One, let me tell you what the Genius Switch includes, because Dr. Barone and his team built a complete recovery system for the Chosen One who has identified the receiver deficit and is ready to address it with the specific mechanism it requires. The core is the 8-minute daily sequence, the protocol that directly restores the synchronization mechanism. It produces cumulative improvement over consistent practice. The first session begins the process. The second builds on the first. The third on the second. The compounding of the restoration mirrors the compounding of the deficit in reverse, and it is faster than the drift, because the targeted mechanism works directly with the synchronization pathway, rather than relying on the slow, natural process of drift correction. Alongside the core sequence, at no additional cost, Dr. Barone and his team include 4 additional resources that support the full recovery from the dangerously behind state. The first is a guided visualization designed for the person in the transition from the drifted receiver state to the restored state. It helps the mind form specific pictures of what the calling looks and feels like when the receiver is operating at the level it was designed for. The receiver that can picture the restored state is already partially inhabiting it. This visualization accelerates the movement from the identified deficit to the experienced restoration. The second is a practical guide to the 10 foods most commonly found to be associated with cognitive fog and reduced synchronization efficiency, and the specific alternatives that support the kind of mental clarity the restored synchronization produces. The body is the platform the receiver runs on. What goes into the platform affects what comes through the receiver. The Chosen One addressing the receiver deficit will want the platform optimized for what the recovery is producing. The third is a foundational text on abundance that addresses the scarcity orientation that the receiver deficit tends to produce over time and helps the receiver recalibrate toward the abundance orientation that full synchronization naturally supports. The calling was released into abundance. The drifted receiver tends to experience it through the narrower frame that reduced synchronization produces. This resource addresses that at the level of framework and orientation. The fourth is a printable guide to 5 daily practices that create the conditions most favorable for the restored receiver to maintain its restored state and compound its restoration over time. The conditions that the practice produces are maintained and deepened through the daily framework the guide provides. The entire system is backed by an unconditional money-back guarantee. No conditions, no required justification, no time limit specified beyond the reasonable return window. Every dollar returned if the Genius switch does not produce the synchronization restoration I have described. The risk of trying it is functionally zero. The list price is $49 on the page where Dr. Barone and his team make it available, accessible through the link in the description below and the pinned comment above. There is a $10 reduction applied. $39 for the complete recovery system. Read the page. Take the time the decision deserves. And be honest with yourself about what you recognized when I walked you through the 5 characteristics. That recognition is the identification. This is the recovery path. Chosen one, I want to spend time on the avoidance signal before we reach the closing, because at this point in the message, for many of you, the avoidance signal is active, and I want to address it specifically. The avoidance signal is the neurological pattern that activates most powerfully at the point of closest proximity to the specific thing that would address the specific deficit. It activates right here, at the moment when the recovery mechanism has been identified and the action that recovers is closest to being taken. The avoidance signal does not present itself as avoidance. It presents as reasonable caution. It raises things worth considering. The cost of the $39, the uncertainty about whether this particular mechanism is right for this particular person, the question of whether the diagnostic was accurate, whether you really are in the dangerously behind state, whether perhaps the 5 characteristics you recognized are just the ordinary challenges of a difficult season rather than the specific deficit I described. I want to offer you a specific way to evaluate each of these concerns. On the cost. $39 backed by a full money-back guarantee is not a financial risk. It is an option to try at zero net cost if the mechanism does not produce what is described. The comparison that matters is not between $39 and zero. It is between the cost of the continued deficit compounding and the cost of trying the recovery mechanism at zero net financial risk. That comparison is not close. On the uncertainty about fit, the 5 characteristic diagnostic is the standard for fit, CRAPTA. If you recognized yourself in 3 or more of those characteristics, the diagnostic has been met. The avoidance signal is the mechanism that makes you question whether the recognition was accurate, precisely at the moment when acting on the recognition would cost the avoidance signal its power. The recognition is the evidence. The questioning of the recognition is the signal. On the ordinary challenge explanation, ordinary challenges of difficult seasons do not produce the specific pattern I described. They produce difficulty. They produce pressure. They produce the experience of things being hard. They do not produce the specific pattern of decisions that are consistently more effortful than your formation should produce. Prayer that is more effortful than the channel should be, practices producing diminishing returns at the same level of input, the background awareness of something not quite reaching, the gap between knowing and executing that is wider than expected. That specific pattern is the receiver drift, not ordinary challenge. The action is simple. The link is in the description below and the pinned comment above. The page has everything you need to make a fully informed decision. Read it, and let the decision be informed by the recognition rather than overridden by the signal. Chosen one, I want to walk you through something before the closing declaration. I want to show you what the watch posture actually looks like from the inside, because God said to watch. And the watch posture is not passive. It is the specific active posture of a receiver that has cleared other inputs and made itself fully available to what it is watching for. Give your full attention to what is happening right now, not to what comes next, not to what was happening before this message found you. to what is present right now. The identification that happened in this message, the recognition of the characteristics, the naming of the gap, and the specific mechanism that produced it, and the specific recovery that addresses it. I want you to picture what the restored receiver state feels like, not from the perspective of what you are missing right now, from the perspective of what returns. Picture a decision that would normally feel effortful, feeling clear, not magically clear, with no thought. Clear in the specific way that the integrated spiritual practical coordination produces, where the knowing and the analyzing are working together instead of in sequence. Picture what prayer feels like when the channel is open, rather than requiring effort to open. The difference between reaching for something and being in the same room as the thing you are reaching for. Picture what the same input that has been producing diminishing returns produces when the receiver is at full synchronization, not more input. The same input at full depth. Hold that picture, not as aspiration, as preview, as the receiver recognizing the description of its own fully functioning state. That recognition is real. The memory is in the receiver. The receiver knows what it was designed to feel like, because it was designed to feel like that, and some portion of it remembers. Notice what just happened when you held that picture. Something specific shifted in the interior, a slight opening, a small movement in the direction of the clarity being described. That shift is the receiver beginning to respond to the identification of its own restored state. It is the beginning of the closing of the blind spot. And the daily practice is what takes it all the way from this beginning to the consistent restoration of the full synchronization. Type "watching" in the comments if you received this message the way it was sent, as identification, as recovery path, as the specific outside signal that the inside blind spot required. Chosen one, let me close this message where it began. God said to drop everything and watch, not as a general spiritual instruction, as a specific signal about a specific moment. This moment, the moment where the identification of the receiver deficit was possible, the moment where the recovery mechanism was being pointed to, the moment where the outside signal was breaking through the inside blind spot. You dropped everything. You watched. And, in watching, you received several things. You received the identification of the dangerously behind state as a specific condition, the receiver drift, that is distinct from failure or faithlessness, and that has a specific cause in the sustained demands of the chosen one calling applied to the ordinary human system over time. You received the 5 characteristics diagnostic that gives the dangerously behind state a recognizable shape rather than leaving it as a vague spiritual concern. You received the specific understanding of the blind spot and why the outside signal was necessary for the identification that the inside perspective could not produce. You received the neurological framework that makes the receiver drift not just a spiritual concept, but a specific, addressable mechanism with a specific, targeted recovery path. You received the stories of 2 people who recognized the drift and experienced the specific recovery that the targeted mechanism produced. And you received the specific recovery mechanism itself, the Genius Switch, $39, 8 minutes a day, an unconditional money-back guarantee. The link in the description below and the pinned comment above. The dangerously behind state has a specific recovery path. You are on it right now. The identification has happened. The path has been shown. The action is the next step. Type "watching" in the comments, not as a statement of complete understanding, as the declaration that the watch posture was taken and the identification was received and the action is being considered from that position. We seal this over your life, over the receiver returning to its full synchronization capacity, over the calling being received at the depth it was always broadcasting at, over the gap between the input released and the input received, closing with each day of the recovery practice. You heard the warning. You watched. Now act on what you watched. And so it is.